Welcome to the Dialogue Book Report, where we talk about literature of interest to LDS readers. I'm Andrew Hall, an editor at Dialogue, coming to you from Fukuoka, Japan. Today I'm joined by three authors whose short stories have appeared in the new book, The Path in the Gate, Mormon Short Fiction, edited by myself and Robert Raleigh, and published by Signature Press. And the authors are Alison Brimley, the author of It's a Good Life, William Morris, the author of Always to be Found, and Jack Harrell, the author of The Mathematics of God. Well, could we start by each of you giving us a brief introduction of your stories? Alison, would you like to start?
Yeah, my story is about a teenage girl, member of the church, who suddenly wakes up one day and realizes that she has omnipotence of some sort, that she can cause anything to happen by just thinking it or wishing it. And how that actually becomes kind of paralyzing for her, how that interacts with her belief in a God who has a certain plan for her, has some kind of will for her, but is not communicating that to her as far as she can tell, and how, just how that impacts her faith and becomes actually like a big obstacle to her having faith, knowing that she has unlimited power and doesn't know what she is supposed to do with it.
And I want to talk about that. This interaction of the speculative with the impact on faith. That's a really great way of taking it. But William, tell us about yours.
My story is called Always to be Found. It takes place in a future where the majority of the members of the church are located in South America, and they are building generation ships that they are going to launch and find a new home. And the story itself comes in the form of a report from a man in his early 30s, or actually late 20s, who is tending to a group of 70s of the church who are in these pods that allows them to connect to the metaverse or virtual reality or whatever you want to call it. And they're out looking for lost sheep, so to speak, members of the church who might be able to be connected to in the metaverse and convinced to come join and get on the generation ships because they're about to launch. And so he goes in search of these 70s and in the metaverse and finds different situations with each of them.
Okay. And Jack, can you tell us about your story?
Yeah, my story is called The Mathematics of God, and it's about a guy who, we won't talk about which relative of mine this is sort of based on this part, a guy who he's kind of a cybersecurity guy. He owns a home, but he lives in the basement, and he's got all kinds of screens and things like that down there, and he rents out the upper part of the house, and a brother and sister from Ukraine move in to rent this place upstairs, and he feels as though he needs to tell especially the sister about the Book of Mormon and introduce her to the gospel, and feels really strongly about this, but it's also mixed up in the fact that she's an attractive woman and he's a guy who lives in the basement surrounded by screens all the time and has a difficult time handling this sort of thing. And then trouble ensues.
Well, let's maybe start off with some questions of each other. And I noted that I know all of you as short story authors primarily. I know Jack has a novel out. But mostly I know you from your short stories. And this collection has a variety of authors of different kinds of publication histories. But definitely all three of you are people, when I thought of creating this book, definitely people I wanted to go to because I love the inventiveness of your story. So I'd like to hear maybe some of the process about how you come up with your ideas and how you write them, and also just questions from each other about your stories. William, do you have any questions for maybe the other two first? We'll kick off that way.
Yeah. So my first question's for Alison, which was So as I was reading, I found myself really looking forward, both with excitement and a little bit of dread to seeing what Gemma would do next with her powers. And I was wondering with not necessarily where the idea for that came from, but rather what were the first few uses of her power that you came up with, like specific uses?
Honestly, I don't remember. I think in my mind all of the uses of her power were about on the same level. Like none of them seems more important to the plot than any other. Because she really is a character who is afraid to do something too consequential. And so I didn't really think of her as like having any kind of plan or making any kind of grand, any kind of grand action without being certain of what its consequences would be, or without being certain that that's what she was meant to do. So yeah, I really don't remember what I envisioned first. It did take me quite a while to think of like what would be the conclusion to the story. I really didn't know how to end it. But I do think she's a character who's very much, I think, based on myself as a teenager. I think obviously we had very different life experiences, but I kind of think that's probably what I would have done. I think it's kind of a trope out of like a fantasy or YA type of novel to be suddenly granted magical powers, and yet I feel like if I were in that situation, I would be probably afraid to really do anything with those.
What I thought that worked really well, because she quickly sets some boundaries. Like, and as an example, I was kind of worried when Gemma disappeared the food from her stomach. I was like, oh, are we going to go down that route? And then you quickly let us know that that was not something she would continue to do. And that was a relief because it really let me focus, by setting the boundaries that you did, it let me focus more on the actual point of the story, which is less the powers and more about kind of what's the will of God, what is free agency, and what do you do when you have power in relation to that. So I thought that was awesome. I also wanted to ask, so when you say the ending, there's kind of two endings, right? There's the events that take place at the high school dance, which I won't spoil, and then there was kind of where Gemma finds herself a few years later in life.
Mm-hmm.
And like at what point in the writing process did those come like both at the same time, or one and then the other, or like I'm just curious about that because it to me it was an interesting ending because it would feel, I think, incomplete without the coda for me. Like if we just ended with what happened at the high school dance, I think the story would have felt incomplete. It wouldn't have like fulfilled all the ideas that it did. But then by adding the additional ending, it was like, okay, yes, this is awesome.
Good. I'm glad you felt that way. Yeah, I was interested, and again, I do not remember which came first, but I was interested in writing that sort of epilogue that, in a way, I think you could attach that to any sort of loss of faith story that would happen in a more traditional or more expected way. I think we typically think of like a difficult trial leading to a loss of faith because of something really bad that happened, or trying to reckon with like evil things that might happen in the world, or basically like human powerlessness in the face of God's will and trying to reconcile those two things. And so I was just interested in the idea of how actually having unlimited power might lead to the same type of faith crisis and the same type of sort of falling away, and like in very mundane terms, like just like I don't know, I'm not really telling my parents about it, like it's kind of this awkward thing between us, like I stopped going to church. It's just very mundane, but like preceded by very unusual events.
Nice.
Can I chime in?
Yes.
So this trope, right? It's connected to you're young, and suddenly you are starting to have these superpowers, right? And part of it is sexual, but part of it is just the power to be an adult and to make decisions. And it's really kind of scary, right? I think it's so interesting what you're doing there, because she has all these powers and she does immediately recognize the need to to bridle them, to use a church term for that. And then I think it's so interesting with the ending how it does become, sometimes you have these opportunities and it's overwhelming, right? And maybe you choke, right? You're just like, oh, I have this these incredible opportunities and I don't know what to do. And the end or something like that. So that's very interesting what you're doing there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I really hadn't thought of it in that context. I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but that a lot of these like more YA genre type of stories could be somewhat metaphorical for the power and the crisis and all these changes that come with becoming an adult. I really hadn't thought of my particular story in those terms. But yeah, I think it could.
It all goes back to I was a teenage werewolf, right?
Yeah.
Right? Where hair is growing on my body and I'm freaking out.
Right. And yeah, it was very fun for me, like as an adult now, to write. Like I said, I think this character has so much in common with myself as a teenager, and to just like go back and reconnect to a lot of the things that really did happen to me as a teenager, a lot of things that didn't, obviously. But yeah, just like how would myself as an uncertain teenager with like one certainty, which is that God is aware of me and God wants something specific for me and that I need to figure out what that is. Like that is the certainty. And then everything else is just, you're kind of on your own to piece those two things together.
Well, and so this is where using speculative fiction is interesting, because sometimes there are readers, and even sometimes on occasion authors, who are tempted to take something speculative and really flatten it down into allegory. But that's not really what speculative fiction is. It's about. It's about actually keeping the complexity, at least for the most part, in my opinion, keeping some of the complexity of a realism, but with heightening certain things, or taking certain ideas and saying, okay, how can we make this extreme or interesting or different or weird? And so, because I'm not necessarily interested in reading allegory, but I want there to be ideas and I want there to be symbolism in the story. And so, which is all a way of saying that, like, I like it when authors are confident in their use of the speculative. And so I was really glad that you didn't really have ambiguity in there about whether Gemma's power existed or not. Like it did. And the fact of his existence doesn't, that's not what the story is about. And it doesn't either answer all of her questions about free will and the nature of God. It just raises the stakes of those questions and allows them to play out in this way that's a little bit more, I won't say more interesting, because obviously if you do the story as a straight realism story, it would also be interesting, but bring something different to that kind of narrative and those kinds of important questions.
Yeah. It was fun to delve into that world, because I really do not write speculative fiction. I do tend to write more straight realism. But it was fun to play with that and just see what different kinds of questions could be raised in a very unrealistic setting. But I had a question for you, actually, William, on the topic of speculative fiction. I wondered about your story. First of all, if you would call it speculative or if you would call it more hard sci-fi. Do you see it as a speculative scenario, or do you see it as something that is like a possible realistic vision for the future of Mormonism?
Sure. That's a great question. So I am one of those annoying people who think that science fiction and fantasy doesn't really exist and that we should just call all literature fantastica or all literature speculative. So in one sense, yes, I am pulling tropes, none of them necessarily at all new to the field, from kind of near future, hard-ish science fiction. Although I'm trying to put some interesting twists on it. But for me, what was most important was less the science fictional apparatus and the opportunity something like the metaverse gave for me to put these 70 in these really different situations from maybe what they might find themselves in where we're at now, and figure out how they would react to them and what would happen. And what are some of the consequences of the sort of embodied disembodiment that comes with spending that much time in a metaverse or a virtual reality or cyberspace? And so yes, on the one hand, it is near future science fiction. The story, even, I mean, if I won't say that there is a straight continuity with all of my near future science fiction Mormon short stories, but certainly this picks up on ideas that are found in some of my other stories as well. And so in that sense, yes, I am making a bit of a prediction, but really, this is a total trope to say that all science fiction is really less about the future and about where we're at now and what we're worried about now and concerned about now. And so, it could have just been Facebook. But it was more fun to make it, not Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, how about William? Do you have a question for Jack? And then maybe Alison too about their stories.
Yeah, I'm gonna. So this is about your story, but it's about other kind of works from Mormon literature, even beyond Mormon literature, which is, why is having a main character who is interested in bringing together kind of faith and science and technology or philosophy or some strict discipline and smashing together so compelling?
That's a great question. That's such a great question that I'm going to have to think. Well, I think just beginning from this story, I just started with where this guy is, and like I said, I do have a relative who he does distance work, and one day we went to visit him, and we go around the back of the house, downstairs, we walk into his living room, and there are like 9 screens all over in the living room and on the kitchen counter. And he said he goes into work like once a month or something. And so, I was just like, whoa, this is, I don't know what I think of this. And so, just beginning with a character like that, and that's just kind of where I took it. And then wondering, who lives upstairs? And this guy really was renting out the upstairs to a woman and so on. So, why is it compelling? Well, I guess it's compelling because it's the world we live in, right? And we want to make, I think, anything that's meaningful to us, we want to make it meaningful in the present, I think, don't we? No one wants to live in the past. So if there are things that are important to me now, I could try to just say, I'm not going forward with the future, but that's not very healthy. So we've got to put these things together, and we got to make we got to make sense of it all, right?
Yeah. And there's what I love is that, at one point he makes this very elaborate, I guess that's the word I'd use, virtual reality presentation for the brother and sister that live upstairs, and because he thinks that the using technology is going to appeal to them, and of course it completely falls flat. But it just seemed like I could totally see somebody doing that, going, okay, this is the upgrade from the film strips that I used to show when,
Right.
if I was old enough to use film strips when I was a missionary.
Yeah. And I could say one more thing. I think the only thing I thought of in advance to say about this story, at the time when, Andrew, when you sent out the invitation, so I wrote this story for this anthology, and I'd be interested to know, did we all three do that? Did we all write this story for this anthology? We had nothing before the invitation.
Nope. Yeah, I wrote it for this one.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
That's really cool. Well, I had just been watching podcasts and lectures about mathematics, which I don't really know anything about, actually. Like, that formula is totally bogus. But one of the things that I had heard time and again from these mathematicians is the idea that it doesn't seem very plausible to say that human beings created math. In fact, what mathematicians always talk about is how they discovered some connection or some formula. So this is a phenomenon. Whatever math is, it seems to exist before we discover it. It seems to be true in and of itself in some way. And it's hard to say that, if somebody wants to say somehow we evolved mathematics or human beings or whatever, that's not very plausible, because it makes sense. It's true. It's universal. And it was already there when we got there. And I think that was one of the things that was really fascinating to me, that made me think about writing a story about a guy who's, in the cyber world, and he's a math geek, and he's like, doing formulas on the board. I have a son-in-law who sometimes he gets distracted by doing I can't, algorithms. I don't even know what they are. My daughter has told me about this. He'll get distracted and he'll be working on a math problem for like an hour when he's supposed to be doing something else, because you know how you just get caught up in these things, right?
Well, no, I don't know how I get caught up in math problems, but other things, sure. So one of the other things I want to ask about Jack is that I was surprised. One of the things I didn't see coming. Okay, well, let me back up a little bit, related to the math point and your main character to Preston, is like, here's a case for the humanities. If he understand a little bit more about human behavior and was a little bit able to pick up on social cues, right? Maybe things would have gone a little bit differently. But one of the things that surprised me about the story was when we get near the end and we discover the intensity of feeling and knowledge of the church that Stanislaw, the Ukrainian brother, has. And I was just wondering, was the character kind of designed that from the beginning, or is that something you discovered while you're writing?
Right. That's one of those things, and I'm sure we all know this, about how you're into the story and then things start to develop that you're even surprised at, and like, oh, okay, yeah, that was a discovery in the writing process that he was this person. I got to throw in this other little footnote here about this. When I wrote this story, or when I started the story at least, this is when Donald Trump was going through the whole thing with the phone call to Ukraine, and Ukraine was the bad guys, right? And now it's coming out, and now Ukraine's the good guys, and the Russians are the bad guys. And Andrew, I almost at one point emailed you and said, should we switch it, and should we make Stanislaw Russian? But I thought, you know what? I don't know if it matters. Did you think about this?
No,
No,
I'm not clear exactly what they were. I mean, were they government operatives, or were they are the
Sorry, yeah,
they're just kind of,
I don't know,
figures.
part of the mafia.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of reasons why Ukrainian hackers could be in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah,
or from any country.
On that too, I think there's some virtue as a storyteller in saying, like, I don't even know what these people are myself, because it doesn't matter, and all the more fun, So if you ask, who are they really, I would say, I don't know.
Yeah, that was the question that I had, because that was the thing that I found so compelling about the story. At that point, when you learn about Stanislaus' reaction, I was kind of expecting him to launch into this story like, I was baptized in Ukraine when I was 16 or whatever, but you never really get that. We don't really know exactly what his connection is. And I feel like both he and, is it Kaja? Is that how?
Kaja, I think.
They both have so much mystery to them, like so many unanswered questions about what they really want out of these interactions that we don't really get an answer to. It just seems that this is such a failure of missionary work on the part of the narrator that the reason that we don't know much about them is because he doesn't know. He's consumed with, like, it's clear to me that Kaja, in their conversations, she doesn't care about math. She doesn't care about the Book of Mormon. These are things that the narrator is trying to understand by helping them, forcing them to illuminate each other, I guess. But it's clear that she is not interested in those things. But then I'm left wondering, but what is she interested in? Because it seems she actually does have a connection with him, that she wants something out of a relationship with him. But I really don't know what it is, and I don't think he knows.
Yeah. Well, and so far you said my character has terrible social cues and he's an awful missionary, and that's totally fine. I think that's a part of the whole thing.
But the great thing about the story, though, Jack, is there also is this layer where he does receive bits of inspiration. Now, we don't, as a reader, we have to judge on how inspired that inspiration is. But he's not just fully working only from the rational side of himself. He does have some faith, and he does receive some bits of inspiration, including a very interesting moment towards the end. So, yeah. And I think I'm maybe asking the question there, can you get revelation through math? And I would think the answer would have to be yes. So, yeah, or he's crazy. He's just a little intense and socially awkward.
You go. Yeah.
Well, Jack, do you have any questions for the other?
Yes. Yes. Well, I loved both of the stories, and Alison, I got to tell you, well, I don't know if you'll like this or not. My wife and I, we like to watch Hallmark movies when, and so when when the story first started, it's a girl and there's a dance and all of this and all of that. It was just really good, really engaging right away with all that. And then I thought it was very interesting. There was a dark moment where what is she doing? Like cutting the back of her hand and then healing it up. That was intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you flinch at that yourself, or did you, were you like, and how did you decide how far to take that?
Yeah, I think, I guess there's a couple of those moments. And like William mentioned, the evaporating food from her stomach, I think is another kind of similar one, where it's like, these are ways that we know, like, teenagers do engage in these behaviors. And if given unlimited powers, like, what would they actually do to themselves? But again, I guess I was just trying to access my own psyche as a teenager. And I think, fortunately, I did not struggle with those kinds of actual, like, self-harm behaviors. I feel like I was fortunate to be like pretty mentally healthy as a teenager. But again, I was just interested in, like William mentioned, those boundaries that she places on herself because she's afraid to take things too far. And those kind of things just fell into the category of like, I'll try it once because I can, and it's weird that I can do this kind of thing to myself with no consequence. But yeah, I wasn't really trying to explore like how much damage she could do to herself or to other people, but rather like how, like what is her mental state that she is so concerned with not doing any kind of damage, even with good intentions.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certainly a moment in this story where it's, as a reader, I'm like, okay, we're not messing around now. You know, this is serious stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, I guess I just felt I had to up the stakes. It's hard to write about a character who is afraid to act because at some point it's like, why are you the main character of the story? Like, what are you actually going to do? So I knew that she had to do something, but something that was consistent with who her character actually was.
Yeah. So I do have a question for William too.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't read a lot of science fiction. And so how do you decide as a writer, you know, this is going to go in an anthology with a bunch of other stories that may not be like this at all. So how do you decide where you're going to have a comma and then explain what that fancy word is, or where you're just going to let it go and say, you know, they're going to get the gist of it and it's going to be fine? How do you make that decision?
Sure. That is, well, so I am in the situation where I write science fiction, Mormon science fiction. I write Mormon faithful realism. I write weird Mormon stories, and it's always a question of how much do I explain with it. All three of them actually, and so with the science fiction, I figured that I would stick with somewhat fairly well-known tropes of you know, bodies in pods or whatever, however you want to picture them, you know, hooked up to things to the mechanisms that will keep them alive, and then able to directly access some sort of a cyberspace experience. And so I always try to err on the side of letting the reader figure it out, because it's I hate over explaining things. However, one of the things that I did with this particular story is I did put it in the form of a report. And the beauty of using a format like that is that it allows you to do some exposition and explain some things, right, in a way that isn't just like the old science fiction trip of, well, as you know, Bob, the potentiometer does this and this and this, and so that was part of what made, in my mind, the story work was being able to turn it into a report, and so that I could focus on just the kind of the narration that I felt I needed to focus on in order to tell the story, and not worry about any mechanisms that are about how he, the narrator gets from A to B or what happens in between, and he can just kind of summarize the parts he needs to summarize and go into more detail on the parts that he needs to go into more detail on.
What?
I was wondering, this story reminded me somewhat of like a George Saunders story. I wondered if he's an influence on you at all.
I've read a little bit of George Saunders, not a whole lot. I would say no. However, there is a whole group of writers who I would say are more towards genre from where George Saunders is, that are influences. Sophia Samatar, Cage Johnson, a few others. And so there is a certain school of what you might call more literary speculative fiction that I very much enjoy reading, and that my writing falls into. And I mean, I'm actually contemporaneous with some of these authors, so they're not necessarily direct influences. A lot of it is actually having the same influences that they also have. So, because there's that as well. Because I basically grew up and read science fiction and fantasy a little bit as a teenager, but not a ton of it, and read a lot of literary fiction as a teenager, and a lot of literary fiction as a college student, and then started reading more science fiction and fantasy, and so kind of came by my interest in genre in a way that is inextricably mixed up with all the literary stuff that I read as well. And so that just kind of naturally manifests in the way I approach my writing.
Then,
well, can we maybe talk a little bit about the appeal of writing short fiction? Like I say, all of you have been writing a lot of short fiction, and also Mormon fiction. And all of you have written about Mormon themes and other stories as well. And, of course, not all. A lot of your stories don't have Mormon themes, Mormon characters, but a lot of them do, it seems like. So either one of those kind of questions, what is the appeal of writing short fiction as opposed to a novel? Or at least why has that been the majority of your output that we've seen? And then why Mormon fiction? Jack?
I go first. Yeah, and I did have another novel published by Signature Books, and I think it was 2018, a novel titled Caldera Ridge.
That's right.
So I've done 2 novels and then the book of short stories. I would say in one way, short stories are just as hard as novels, because in order to build those characters and make them real and meaningful, for a short story, you have to do just as much work as you do for a novel. And then the deal with the novel is, okay, you got these people, now you got to move them through more situations and so forth. But on that aspect of the character development, I think it's just as hard to develop characters for a short story as it is for a novel.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer, Andrew, is that there's more of a market for Mormon short fiction than there are for Mormon novels. And which is almost the reverse, I would say, of the national market. I mean, certainly there are all sorts of small magazines out there where, if you want to write literary short fiction or even science fiction and fantasy, but in terms of actually getting published in the field, there's just more of a market for short fiction. But also, it to Jack's point, yes, you have to be able to, it takes a lot of work to conjure the characters in the world, but it is less of a grueling grind to write. Even if you're writing draft after draft after draft of a short story, it's still not, the year and a half it takes to write a novel. And so that is another aspect of it. And I would, and most Mormon writers do not have the luxury of being able to write full time. And so because of all those factors, I want to give you an answer that says, oh yes, because, I feel called to the short story. And there is an aspect to that. I like writing short stories. Short stories is a really interesting form because you can take, we see this, I think, in all 3 of our stories. You can take these situations that are really interesting and unusual and kind of push them to a certain extreme and sustain it, right, in a this concentrated nugget. And there's just a lot of satisfaction in doing that. But and I'm a big believer that part of why writers should write is to be published and to find an audience. And so, I would love to see more of a market for the Mormon novel, and certainly having, BCC Press publishing as much as they do, and Signature continuing to put out, 1 or 2 novels every year or two, it is great. but it's just not, the market's not quite there. So that's my longish answer.
Mm-hmm.
Alison,
Yeah, I feel I have mostly thought of myself also as a short story writer. But when I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, I thought I'm going to try to start a novel because I just know like writing is going to become more difficult for me, and I want like a long-term project that will keep me engaged, something that I can leave and come back to as I need to. And my daughter is now about to turn 5, so it's been a lot more than a year and a half, and I've had another daughter since then, and so it has been very sporadic. But I have, for the last 5 years, really, I have mostly been just working on one novel, and so I personally am feeling excited to try and wrap this project up and get back to short stories, because I feel like I just collide with so many character ideas and plot ideas, and I can't just keep stuffing all of them into one novel. So I want to kind of disconnect from that and like get back to writing in shorter bursts.
Okay. Well, anything else anybody wants to say? Or questions, any other questions you have for the group?
Really appreciate all the work you've done to put this whole thing together, because, like being completely from my own selfish point of view, I have a story I'm pleased with, and it's got a home thanks to your invitation. So that means a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, so we've been joined. Let me just introduce those of you who've read these stories now and you're excited to read more. I'll just let you know that so William has a collection that came out last year called The Darkest Abyss: Strange Mormon Stories. So then this story really could have been in that collection. It fits perfectly.
It could have.
And there's another story from the same world, right? Another of the ships that go to another planet. I love that collection a lot. And has also done a lot of editing lately. He's edited collections called Monsters and Mormons. Another one's called which is a kind of horror. Another one called State the Deseret, which is alternative fiction and alternative histories, I mean. And just has a new Iriantum issue out. Can you tell us about that? What's the Iriantum issue?
So the Iriantum issue is a genre-focused issue. It is mostly science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Although there is some humor, and there is some, well, I don't want to spoil what it is. There's some ones that are a little bit more fairy tale like, I guess is what I would say. Oh, and there's one that you could be viewed as alternate history. But there are poems, there are short stories. There's a great interview between Dave Butler, the Mormon science fiction and fantasy author, and author of strange Mormon fiction as well. Interviewing Sandy Peterson, who is a game developer, worked on Doom, worked on one of the very first role-playing games called Call of Cthulhu. A really interesting video conversation that you can watch. And then there's also a really interesting paper on Brandon Sanderson and the Book of Mormon. And so there's something for everyone in this issue, and it's available at if you go to the associationmormonletters.org, you can get the link to that Iriantum issue.
Okay, great. Yes, I've been diving into those, and I've really been enjoying them.
Oh, can I pitch one other thing, Andrew?
Please.
I also have a story out in Wayfair. I don't know if all your listeners are familiar with Wayfair, which is a Substack publication and also a print publication. They've been running a lot of kind of spooky Mormon fiction during the month of October. And I have a story in there that is about a guy who kind of has some things in common with the main character in Jack's story, in the sense that he has a kind of an intense focus on technology and the world, and it also involves mushrooms. So I'll look for that. It's called Filling the Measure.
It's the Wayfair has been really surprising. I mean, when they first came out, they said, "Oh, we're mostly going to do nonfiction pieces and essays, and maybe we'll do a little bit of fiction." But this last year, at least 9 months or so, they've been doing one story a month, basically, at least one story a month, and so of short fiction. They really dived into it. So that's, along with Dialogue and Iriantum and Sunstone, that's really opened up a new potential place. And they pay, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Allison is, I know you especially from the stories that have won AML Short Fiction Awards, The Pew, that was in Dialogue, and Thin Walls, that was in a literary journal. And so I highly recommend those. The Pew might be the easiest one to get on Dialogue, since all the Dialogue stories are available online. And you're working on a novel. Is there anything else you want to promote?
No, that's all I've got. Like I said, I'm working at a very, very slow pace right now. That's the stage I'm at in my life. So that's about all I've got to talk about right now.
Okay, great. We look forward to the novel. Jack has been the author of 2 novels, Vernal Promises and Caldera Ridge, and a collection of stories, The Sense of Order and Other Stories, that I love that one very much. And then also Writing Ourselves, Essays on Creativity, Craft, and Mormonism, a book about writing. So look for those, everybody. Hey, Jack, what's the name? I'm just right now, the story that appeared in Ariantum that was about a member who meets somebody that might be the devil.
Yeah, it's the title's Calling an Election. So the guy says he's from Salt Lake City, but some weird stuff happens.
Mm-hmm. To say the least.
That's an amazing story. That's when you definitely come out and like say, I don't know exactly what happened here, but so I highly recommend it.
Good.
Okay, let's see. I got a little. Thank you for listening to the Dialogue Book Report. This show is a part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, a collective of independent podcasts that promote inquiry into all aspects of the LDS tradition. Includes wonderful shows like Bass and Hat, featuring Aaron Brewster and Eric Jepson. And it's produced and edited by Daniel Foster Smith, who also provides the music. And to hear more, go to dialoguejournal.com. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings. My name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Dialogue Podcast Network.